Okay.
For about 10 years, I have been on board with election and God's sovereignty and salvation, and have believed it, but I wrestle with God's goodness in it. And about 5 years ago, I moved overseas and I was working with trafficking victims, and we had 4 and 5-year-old girls who had been trafficked, many of whom would contract HIV or be, ravaged by drugs, and then would only hear Buddhism and would die after having lived a life of being abused, and they would never hear the gospel, and then they would go to perdition. And so that's made it even harder to take joy in God and to delight in God. And so for 5 years, I've obeyed and have known I'm the clay, he's the potter, I'm to submit to him. But my heart hasn't changed, and I don't delight in God much more today than I did 5 years ago. So, do I need to pray for God to humble me more? That's a scary prayer, but I'll pray it, I guess. But what do I do?
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly the right kind of question to ask. I don't know whether you need another category in your mind, but I'll give you one and see if it helps. I need the category to handle the death of children, babies, the suffering of little ones, both from man and from horrible, horrible diseases and so on. I need a category that says God's justice is revealed in Romans 1, I think, verses 18, 19, 20, to be such that at the last day, no one will be condemned for not believing in Jesus who hasn't ever heard of Jesus. With me? No one will be condemned for not believing in Jesus who hasn't heard of Jesus. And God knows at what age and at what cultural setting his truth can be understandable to a child, so that I personally don't believe that children who perish before they can comprehend the gospel will be lost. I don't believe they will be. Which means that millions upon millions of aborted babies are going to be saved, and means that these little ones who haven't gotten to the place where they can rebel, because they don't know anything, rebel against, won't be lost. Now, that's got all kinds of issues that have to be addressed, but to state the principle. Then the question asks, but what about their suffering? What about their suffering up till the point that they die and go to be with Jesus? And my second principle I would add is nobody suffers anything in this world that either he doesn't deserve or, being undeserved, will be made up for in the resurrection. When Paul says, I count that the sufferings of this world are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed, I think he's thinking anything is worth it. Anything is worth it. If I could have that, it would make up for all this. So if those little ones die and are saved because they were not able to comprehend the truth of God, God will make up to them the horrors. Here's a third thing that might help. This also helps me. I have often asked, God, why is physical suffering, even horrible and massive physical suffering, an appropriate response to moral evil? A divine response of judgment. When Adam fell, he committed a moral evil. He didn't kill anybody. What he did was spiritually obscene and idolatrous and wrong. And the consequence was physical. He dies. And suffering and futility and death and disease and malformed babies and trafficking comes into the world. And it says God subjected the world to that. Why? Why is that kind of suffering an appropriate response in a fallen world to moral evil? And I think God's answer is, in a fallen world, people don't care about spiritual sin. They care about their bodies. And therefore, I have touched the bodies of humanity as a parable of their spiritual condition. So if you see, for example, if you remember a horrible suffering you saw of a little 4-year-old, and then she died, what your main emotional reaction would be, I hate sin. Because in God's economy, that experience was a dramatic display of the horror of my sin. Hers, I don't know anything about her. I just know me. My sin, our sin, is on display in the diseases of the world. Ebola is about sin, not one-to-one, like here's a person with Ebola, they must have sinned. I mean, John 9 says that's not the case. Who sinned that this man was born blind? It wasn't that anybody sinned, but that the works of God might be manifest. It's not a one-on-one. It's a cataclysmic judgment of God in Romans 8:20 that pain has come upon the world. So at least those three things might help you have categories in which to say, I may not understand all this, but God is good and God is God, and that's going to work out in the end.